Very good.
Okay.
All right. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Sioux Climate Hub's webinar series. My name is Nadine Workington Brain, and I'm a volunteer with the Climate Hub, and I will be the moderator for tonight's session. It's great to see so many of you here, yeah, we're quite thrilled about that. Thanks for joining us. As you may know, the Sioux Climate Hub is a citizen-led volunteer organization dedicated to locally advancing climate change mitigation and adaptation through education and engagement. In addition to this webinar series, we produce a quarterly newsletter and sponsor or participate in a variety of in-person events. We are also a chapter of the Global Climate Reality Project. You can look for us on Facebook and Instagram at Sioux Climate Hub, or you can contact us by email at siouxclimatehub@gmail.com. And we fully welcome new volunteers and participants anytime. Our online webinars are held roughly 6 times per year on the last Wednesday of the month, with a presentation followed by a question and discussion period. Our next event will be held on Wednesday, November 27th, and I'll say a bit more about that at the end. Video recordings of our previous webinars are available on our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to check it out because there are really some excellent things there. If I can go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, about tonight. For tonight's presentation, I'm very happy to introduce Rachel Brain, who will be talking with us about the transformative power of community-owned renewable energy. Rachel is the community's program manager at Repowering London, which is a nonprofit that develops inclusive community-owned renewable energy projects in London, UK. Rachel grew up in the Sioux, and she has an academic background in city design for sustainability. She's spent the last 7 years working with local community cooperatives to tackle big challenges in housing and energy in London. I should also say, for those who don't already know, that I'm Rachel's mom, which might lead you to believe that there was some arm twisting involved in having her do this for us today. And that actually might be true. Especially since it's 11:30 p.m. where she is right now. At the same time, I also know firsthand that she is really keen about sharing the possibilities of community-owned energy, and I think she's really looking forward to doing that with us today. So I'll thank her in advance for doing this. In terms of the format, at the end of the presentation period, after about 30 to 40 minutes, we'll have a bit of time for discussion on some of your questions. For the question period, you can type your questions into the group chat as we go along, and I'll look for them at the end. Or you can wait and hold your questions to the end and then, put up your hand and we'll call on people individually then. And okay, last but not least, in terms of introductory remarks, I'd like to acknowledge with respect that we are in Robinson Huron and Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, and that the land on which we're gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, and specifically the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, as well as the settlement lands of the Métis people. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll turn it over to Rachel. Right.
Thank you. I think I just need you to stop sharing so that I can share my screen.
Yeah, I'm having trouble.
There we go. Okay.
Good.
Give me a second here. Okay. Have you got that okay now? Good.
That's good.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I am excited to be doing this, and in part probably it's a result of me talking incessantly about community energy. So yeah, so nice to be doing in this format. I'm going to talk about community energy, and I'm going to get on to doing that in some more practical terms, and to telling you about some of the work that I'm doing at Repowering London. But I just wanted to start briefly by talking about the idea of storytelling, because I think that in many ways what community energy offers is a different story about energy and about the energy system and who's in control of it, who's making the decisions, who's affected by those decisions, and who kind of ultimately benefits. So this is a quote that I like from an author and activist, Rebecca Solnit. She says, every crisis is in part a storytelling crisis. This is as true of climate chaos as anything else, and we're hemmed in by stories that prevent us from seeing or believing in or acting on the possibilities for change. And in a more hopeful direction, I've also got this quote from Rob Hopkins, who founded the transition movement in Britain about a decade ago, who's also an author and climate activist, who says that people don't need new facts, they need a new story. And if you can change the story, you can change their behavior. And so I just kind of wanted to set that as a bit of framing as we start. Now we tell stories in different ways using different mediums, and the story that I want to tell to set the context is about energy transitions and what the experience of energy transitions has been like for people who've experienced them historically. So I'm going to do this very briefly to set the context with a short history of energy transitions in paintings. This is an idea adapted from a brilliant colleague that I have in London, but I've used Canadian paintings to tell the story in a Canadian context. So we start before the Industrial Revolution, where energy needs were modest, and we basically burnt wood or biomass for heat to cook food and to make goods in kilns, so things like pottery and iron and steel. And so this is a painting called Cooking Chokecherries by a Cree artist named Alan Sapp, where you've got wood burning for energy, and that wood was probably acquired through the kind of muscle power of human energy. So for a lot of people, there would have been a very direct personal relationship with your day-to-day sources of energy. We also had wind and water, so renewable energy sources that could be used to drive simple machines and could also be used for transport, for instance, in the case of wind to power sailing ships, or waterways for the transportation of logs on river currents, as in this painting of Log Driving by Tom Thompson. And so in Canada, we had these really like super abundant supplies of biomass fuel in the form of wood, and combined with the ease of transporting wood on waterways, that's sort of one of the explanations that historians have used to talk about why Canada was actually quite slow to transition to a mineral energy regime. So it wasn't until 1906 that Canadians were getting more of their energy from fossil fuels than from trees. And that's a benchmark that, for instance, England and Wales had reached by 1800. So then we've got a clear major energy transition that happened when we moved from biomass to coal. Coal could be used to heat homes and then to power steam engines, which brought about the advent of forms of transport like trains, as we've got in this painting of the Canadian Southern Railway at Niagara by an artist named Robert Hurd Whale, who painted landscapes. And so coal kind of went on to shape our landscapes through the arrival of the railways, and then also through the way that they kind of opened up wider access to land going west. Then we had another really key era of energy transition that arrived with oil and gas, which is complex to extract, but it's so easy to transport and to burn, to power engines and to generate electricity. So this is a painting by someone named Roland Gissing, who documented the history and development of oil and gas in Alberta from the early 1930s, which it sounds like in many ways was a quite a vibrant period in Alberta's history, as there were kind of all these exploration and related oil companies appearing. But at the same time, you still had these huge distances separating rural households, which meant that the spread of network services for gas and electricity was quite slow. Because early gas and electricity network infrastructure relied on relatively small distances and high population densities to be economically viable. And so the vast majority of rural Canadians never had access to gaslight, and even as late as the 1940s, only 20% of farm homes had central grid electricity. So there's this, as I was looking into this, there's this quite fun like set of advertising materials from the 20s and 30s from Canadian electrical companies, basically trying to build demand for electricity amongst rural households, with pamphlets with titles like summer showers chase fatigue and optometrists talk about home lighting and that sort of thing, basically trying to like champion these health and well-being benefits that would follow increased electrical consumption. And then, of course, as oil and gas production increased in scale and sophistication, and as the industry grew alongside kind of growth in energy consumption and demand, production became in many ways increasingly remote and further removed from day-to-day life for most of us. And so I think that's sort of captured in this painting by Kim Odakje of Shell Oil Oakville in the 70s. And in contrast with some of the earlier paintings, you don't really see where the people would fit into this scene besides maybe a driver in the cab of the truck. So it's, in many ways kind of more removed. And that brings us to this painting, which is actually by an American artist and not a Canadian one, named Ed Ruscha, that captures the most direct interaction that most of us have now with procuring our energy in the day-to-day, which is at the gas station pump. Meanwhile, much of our kind of core oil and gas infrastructure remains relatively invisible to us. So as in the kind of pipeline here that runs under the landscape, in this painting by Wanda Koop. And that's true, this sort of relative invisibility of a lot of this infrastructure is true, even as the relative abundance of accessible energy from oil and gas has really kind of radically shaped our lives. It's driven growth and hugely expanded mobility and made all sorts of things possible. And at the same time, it's shaped global conflicts and changed the climate of the Earth in ways that are dangerous for us. And so that brings us to the present. This is a painting by Amy Shackleton called Winds of Change that I think captures something of climate change impacts, alongside the potential of renewable energy sources that you see in the wind turbines. Because we've got now the technology to harness the solar, wind, and water energy in nature around us to produce electricity in ways that are kind of getting ever easier and more efficient. And it's possible to do that at a smaller, more local scale, which means that it's possible, or there's potential for ordinary people to control and own this energy transition, possibly without some of the huge corporate stakeholders that played a really central role in the last energy transition. So, moving on from the paintings, where are we at now in this current renewable energy transition? At the global level, there's very much a transition underway. This is from the International Energy Agency, capturing global energy investment in clean energy and in fossil fuels since 2015. In the response to the global energy crisis in the last couple of years, there's been this major boost to clean energy investment. And so now for every dollar that's invested in fossil fuels, there's 170 invested in clean energy, and that's changed from a 1-to-1 ratio just in the last 5 years. So it really is quite a big shift. And this is basically a different way to show that data, with $1.7 trillion, which is an enormous amount of money that I can't fathom, invested in clean energy sources in 2023. And all this investment also means jobs for people. In 2020, during the pandemic, there were huge layoffs in the fossil fuel industries, and employment there hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels. But what has happened is that there's been this dramatic surge in jobs in clean energy sectors, which have been employing more than half of energy workers essentially worldwide since 2021. And that's true across most regions. So all this to say, a transition is happening. What it's not doing is happening fast enough. This is a model from the International Renewable Energy Agency for how our energy sources would need to shift within the next 25 years in order to keep global heating to about 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Obviously, there's already lots of concern, or many of you will probably know there's already lots of concern about the 1.5 degree target and whether it's still kind of possible at all. But this is how the International Renewable Energy Agency has modeled it. So really the scale and speed that we need from this transition is enormous. And in Ontario, we're actually going in the wrong direction at the moment. So Ontario's electricity system has become dirtier since 2017. This is data from the Ontario Energy Board put together by the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And it shows that we've got a growing proportion of our electricity supply that's been coming from greenhouse gas plants since 2017. And moving forwards, the independent electricity system operator for Ontario has proposed an emissions cap, so-called cap, that would essentially allow greenhouse gas pollution in Ontario to be more than 5 times greater in 2035 than it was in 2017. So that's a sort of countercurrent mixed into all of this. And all of this, sort of framing about transitions brings us to the question of where individuals and communities fit into these transitions. We've already got some existing inequalities in the energy system. So there are people who can't reasonably afford the energy that they need, for instance, to heat their homes. From Stats Canada, households are defined, well, there are lots of different metrics that are used for energy poverty, basically, but Stats Canada defines a household as being energy poor if 10% or more of their household income after tax is spent on their energy bills at home. And so in the 2021 census, there were some 820,000 households in Canada that met this criteria, which is about 6% nationally. There's also an organization called Efficiency Canada that's kind of collating this data using different measures of energy poverty, who estimates it's probably more like 13% of households across Canada. But there's huge regional variation from province to province. So that's what we've got in this map is kind of an estimated proportion of households who might be experiencing fuel poverty and struggling to pay their energy bills. So in this context of transitions and existing inequalities, how do we make sure that we don't leave anyone behind in the renewable energy transition? And really importantly, I think, how do we make this something that's not only necessary to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, but actually something that's also really good for people? And I think community energy offers one answer to that question. So a very broad definition that you could use for community energy is that it's referring to collective citizen ownership or leadership of clean energy production and energy efficiency projects. This can look all sorts of different ways in practice, and I'll come on to some more sort of key concepts later, but that's my very rough working definition. You will notice that energy efficiency is there alongside clean energy production. So we're not necessarily just talking about how energy is produced, but also how it's used, because if we ultimately want to get, Because if we ultimately want to get a larger proportion of our energy from clean energy sources, you can go about getting there in one of two different ways. The first way is to increase the proportion of our energy production that's coming from clean energy sources. So if your energy supply is a pie, we're talking about basically cutting a much bigger slice of the pie for renewables. But the second way you can go about that is by increasing the proportion. The second way you can go about that is by increasing the proportion by shrinking the size of the pie itself. So basically, if we reduce our total energy demand and consumption, then it becomes easier to provide a larger proportion through renewable energy sources. And so one of the easy ways to do that, particularly in cold countries, is through things like better insulation for homes, retrofitting existing homes. And that's something that can really improve people's lives in tangible ways as well, by reducing their bills and potentially making their homes warmer and more comfortable, all whilst reducing our total energy demand. So helping to make that shift towards kind of more dependence on renewable sources easier. So all that to say, that's why we've got energy production and energy efficiency here in this very rough working definition. But in practice at the moment, a lot of community energy projects tend to focus on the production side of things. So my organization, Repowering London, is, as my mum said in the intro, is a not-for-profit organization in London in the UK that basically works to support groups of local people to plan, fund, and build low carbon projects that benefit them. And this is very grandiose sounding, but the kind of mission we're structured around is to support all Londoners to participate in and benefit from the transition to a low carbon society. So really this piece about making sure that no one's left behind in the renewable energy transition is sort of at the core here. And we sort of tackle three intersecting, I guess, crises at once when we do this. First is obviously the climate crisis. So we're developing renewable energy projects that help to decarbonize the grid. Second is the energy crisis. There are very high levels of fuel poverty in the UK that are sort of, I guess, worse now than ever post 2022. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine had a big impact, but it's always been there, and cooperative community energy projects can help basically people who have been kind of ill-served by the existing energy system to play a role in creating an alternative. And then there's also this sort of workforce strand, which is that there's this whole emerging this whole emerging industry, really, and kind of set of green jobs in the renewable energy transition. And there's a bit of connecting up the dots to kind of make sure that people who are local to some of these projects that we're going to talk about are benefiting. So Repowering London, like I said a couple slides back, supports more local level community energy cooperatives. This is a map of the boroughs in London. There's 32 of them. London is big. And we have supported renewable energy cooperatives to get set up in 8 of them to date. So a little map kind of showing where they're located, and you also get the variety in local community co-op logos here. broadly operating on a sort of similar model that I'll talk you through in a minute. A similar sort of core model, I guess. But there are also lots of sort of place-based specific nuances that come through in these different neighborhoods. And that's really cool to see as well. And I think that's really a reflection of how the community energy model is very context specific, even kind of within London, moving from borough to borough, we get different sort of flavor in the energy cooperatives that we're supporting. So the core model for most of these co-ops looks something like this diagram. Basically, members of a local community invest some money in a project, and it's an investment that they make. It's not a donation. They invest some money, and that money goes into the community benefit society, or the co-op, basically the kind of the organizing structure. And then that co-op uses the money to install local renewable energy assets. So in this case, it's generally rooftop solar. There's not a lot of land going spare in London. And so it's often rooftop solar on community buildings like libraries or schools or like kind of rec centers. But we've also delivered solar on housing, and we've got projects in the works at the minute to kind of look at putting rooftop solar on a theater and a swimming pool and all sorts. So the rooftop solar installation is funded by this pot of money that's been put together by people investing. And then once the solar panels are installed, the installation starts generating income because it's producing electricity, which has value and can be sold. It's generally sold first to the building underneath. So if it's a library, the library is the sort of first port of call for where that electricity goes. Projects tend to offer a discount on electricity bills for community buildings. So 5 to 10% discount on whatever rate they're otherwise paying to a private supplier for their electricity. So they like that. And then any electricity that's not used by the building goes back into the grid, and there's a power purchase agreement with a energy supply company, where basically there's some money that comes in for any power that's fed back into the grid. It's not a generous rate, but it's something. And so this model works best where most of the electricity is being sold to the building occupier. So then you've got money coming in to the co-op. Once that money's coming in, the first thing it does is it goes to paying like maintenance and operation costs, which are relatively minimal. And that's kind of a service that Repowering London is providing for the local level co-ops. They pay a very small amount for it. The second thing that money does is it goes to pay the people who originally invested in the install some interest on their investment, typically about 3% a year in the projects that I'm talking about, but it could be, it's kind of commonly up to about 6% for projects in the UK. So people are making a return on their investment, an annual return. And of course, they ultimately, over the lifespan of the project, also get kind of their whole upfront investment back as well. And after all of that's covered, there is money left over, because in this model, we don't have any kind of massive corporate shareholders that we've got to pay off. So the money that's left over goes into a community benefit fund, and that community benefit fund can be used for essentially whatever kind of local causes members of the co-op and the community think are worth supporting. So across the co-ops that Repowering London supports, it's gone to things that community fund has gone to things like mutual aid initiatives during the pandemic, and like youth training programs, and like helping a community center draft proof basically to save on their heating costs, and yeah, things like that, community gardening projects, that sort of thing. So that's the sort of core model. What this looks like in practice with an example. I'm going to tell you about Brixton Energy Solar, which is an early project that Repowering London supported on a social housing estate in South London. Many of the pictures you've seen dotted through so far have been from this estate, and that's basically because there's a nice view from the rooftop there, and so that's yeah, that's where the good pictures are from. But yeah, this dates back to 2013. And when this project was installed, one of the things that was really kind of important and exciting about it was that it was the first time in the UK that this concept of community energy was put into action in an urban affordable housing context. Up until that point, it had typically been something that you saw in a very sort of like rural middle class community, with like some of the really kind of usual suspects, I guess, who might typically be interested in conservation in the countryside and also have some money to invest in a good cause. And so in that context, bringing this community energy model to the rooftops of an affordable housing estate in this sort of, inner city context, I think kind of challenged the idea of who this model might be for. So that's quite cool. Basically, what happened here is there was a group of people who were interested in looking at this sort of project. They ran a successful community share offer to raise the investment to install the solar panels. There's 51 kilowatt peak of solar capacity installed there. And then once those solar panels were installed, the electricity went on to power the communal electrics and the elevators in these blocks. And then profits from the sale of excess electricity went into a community fund. So that's the community fund that I was talking about in the kind of generic model on the last slide, for residents to decide on how to spend it, essentially. And so during the pandemic, this fund on the Repowering Park estate was used to pay for free meals for low-income families, with kids who typically receive free school meals, which is a thing that kids get at school here, basically, if their family's on a low income. But then, of course, during the pandemic, when schools were closed, kids weren't getting fed for free at school, and so people decided to use some of the money from the community fund generated by the rooftop solar panels to pay for some free meals for these families. During the original installation of the solar panels, local young people were offered training opportunities to work under supervision and to develop some new employability skills. And they also learned how to install energy saving measures like draft proofing, and could go on to share those skills with other residents on the estate. And then in 2021, Brixton Energy Solar set up a small pilot project on this estate around what we call a local electricity supply model. So this means that residents who live in the blocks where solar panels are installed have the opportunity to purchase some of their electricity directly from the solar panels that are generating above their heads when the sun is shining. And it's done through what's called a matched tariff. So basically, when their energy usage matches when the solar panels are generating, they pay a reduced rate for that electricity. And it's a really reduced rate. So they pay 5 pence per kilowatt hour, compared to the market rate, which is about 35 pence per kilowatt hour. So that's, that's a big gap, right? And so on an annual energy bill, people who are participating in this pilot are saving about 25%. Now it's just a pilot, and this kind of offers complicated in the UK for all sorts of reasons related to how the energy market works. But we've been working on ways to roll this out more widely, and getting there, and it's exciting. So now that I've given you a real life example, I want to come back briefly to some key sort of concepts or principles of community energy to build out the picture a bit. Oh, this is savings from the pilot project that I was just telling you about at the Repowering Park Estate. So a few key concepts to rattle through here. The first one is decentralization. If we think about what citizen ownership means, we could kind of understand that at a number of different scales, right? There are kind of different ways that a citizen could own a stake in a renewable energy asset. So on one end of the spectrum, we've got the individual scale. Basically, if you own a house and that house has a roof that would work well for solar panels, and you happen to have a chunk of money available up front, or you have access to like loan financing at a reasonable cost, then you can install solar panels on your own roof at a small scale, and you have full control. You get to make all the decisions. And so that's a sort of ownership by individual citizens. But of course, it's not something that's accessible to everyone for all sorts of reasons. And it's also not going to get us decarbonizing probably fast enough. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have like public ownership by a state or a national government, which is technically a sort of ownership by and for citizens, but it happens at such a large scale that you don't have much in the way of direct opportunities to influence decision making, and some of the kind of potential for like more local place-based benefits gets lost along the way. And so the argument here is that there is a nice sweet spot somewhere in the middle at the scale of kind of collective ownership in communities, which is place-based and creates opportunities for local control and benefit. So that's so that's that. There's also sort of key concept here around the idea of democratizing the energy system. I've been referencing community control or shared decision making at various points, but just wanted to expand very briefly on the structure that we use for that in projects that Repowering London facilitates. So our projects and a lot of other community energy projects, including ones in Ontario, are set up to be owned and managed through a cooperative structure. Cooperative is basically a business or organization that's owned and controlled by its members to meet their shared needs. And all co-ops share the same core principles and values. So I really liked this poster from Cooperatives UK, which is our network of co-ops. And they're quite hard to read here because they're quite small, but it's got the kind of core co-op principles on it, which are basically it cooperates with other co-ops, it's owned and controlled by members, it provides education, training, and information, it supports its community, and it's democratic. So every member has an equal say. So that means in a renewable energy co-op context, no matter how much you've invested, you are one member, you get one vote in decision making. And so that's a really sort of, core principle. A third piece I wanted to touch on is around resilience. Obviously, there are different types of resilience. You've got resilient infrastructure, which is what we have when they're kind of limited single points of failure in a system. You've also got organizational resilience, which is some of what's embedded in the cooperative governance model that I've just talked about, where you don't rely too much on kind of any one individual. And then there's also social resilience, which we could think of as a sort of connective tissue in communities that's strengthened through things like community energy projects. So when people are organizing community energy projects in their neighborhoods, they're also learning how to work together through this vehicle that's a community energy co-op. And then when something different happens, for instance, there's a global pandemic or a natural disaster, they already have the skills to work together to respond, and they can mobilize a response much faster and in a much more effective way. And that's what happened with some of the co-ops that Repowering London supports during COVID. Basically, there were already all these people involved who were working together, organizing something locally in their communities. And when COVID arrived, they were basically really quick to respond, which is cool. This is just a nice quote from a volunteer that I think kind of captures some of the spirit of that, from someone who talked about how being involved with their local community energy co-op meant that they had connected with people in their local area, and kind of had this sense of common purpose, and yeah, that they were really kind of getting value out of it, above and beyond the original, kind of energy related purpose. And then this fourth principle, very briefly, is around inclusivity, really coming back to this question about how we make sure no one is left behind in the renewable energy transition. We've recently worked on a project called Community Energy for Energy Solidarity, which was a partnership project with community energy groups in Scotland, England, France, Croatia, and Portugal. So the UK and various bits of Europe, that was focused on the idea of energy solidarity, basically what community energy co-ops could and already were doing to tackle the issue of energy poverty in areas they were working in. Very briefly, what we found is that energy communities were doing a lot, and I don't think I have time to get into any of that any of this in any detail, but you can see that there's a really good range of what they were up to. And that, yeah, I think really kind of reflects this whole idea of bringing people along with us in the renewable energy system transition that we're in. So, final concept, sorry, is decarbonization, which I don't think we need to dwell on, because it's really kind of, it's really kind of, I guess, embedded throughout, but is definitely there at the foundations. So I think, just based on time and to leave some time for questions, I'm going to wrap up, and to do so, just wanted to come back very briefly to the idea of storytelling that I started with. So there's a couple slides to ignore there. This is from a book called Citizens, and it's a good book. And the central premise is that there are these two kind of competing stories about how we shape the future. And so one is called the consumer story, and one's called the citizen story. So the consumer story says our role as individuals is to pursue our own self-interest, and that on that basis, we'll kind of aggregate to the best outcomes for society. And so our choices represent our power and our creativity and our identity, and every organization or institution, so businesses and charities and government, they all exist to basically offer us these choices, and they're kind of reduced to providers of products and services. So that's the consumer story. Then there's this alternate story that's the citizen story, which is what's kind of captured in this quote. And it's a story where we're actively shaping the world around us, and we can imagine something better, and we can take care and responsibility to get there. And I just wanted to end on that, because I think if I leave you with nothing else here about community energy, I'd like to leave you with a question about what it would look like if you considered yourself a citizen rather than a consumer in relation to the energy system. And so that's where I'll stop to leave a bit of time for questions.
Okay,
And yeah.
great. Thank you, Rachel. I don't see any questions. Oh, here we go. Okay, there's one question here. How does Repowering find groups to work with on these kinds of community energy projects? Are they usually existing co-ops already?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Um, the point about or the question, the kind of end of the question about whether they're already existing co-ops, no. Sometimes they are existing sort of community groups. So, um, there's one example I can think of, one of the kind of relatively newly established groups that we've got that started out as a Extinction Rebellion campaigning group that wanted to kind of pivot into something that was a little more, I guess, a little closer to building something positive. And there's another example that I can think of where it started out as basically a community group that was based at a kind of local community center that had been running programs around social isolation. And they kind of got interested in this idea of community energy. So yeah, so sometimes they're an existing group, not necessarily an existing co-op, not necessarily structured around offering services. Sometimes they have come to Repowering asking for support in getting a project off the ground. Sometimes it's happened the other way around, that there's actually been a local authority, or what's kind of functionally it's a municipality, that has been interested in kind of exploring whether this idea could work in their local area, and they've come to us asking if we could kind of seed something, and so we've had to go out and start talking to people about these ideas, and to try to to kind of find a group who might like to take it on from scratch. So yeah, I think that's quite a waffly response. All sorts is the answer.
I think,
Um,
yeah, something that you said there about the municipality kind of leads to a question from Cheryl and Mark about, are the utility providers, for instance, the London version of RPUC here, welcoming
mm,
of these initiatives? So maybe you can say a bit about that.
yeah, it's a good question. I would say, well, as a starting point, it's quite a different context. In terms of how the energy market's set up, where you've got the PUC, that's your kind of your local municipal energy supplier. We've got much more of a free market of corporate energy suppliers competing. So it's already a more crowded space, I guess. There's not a monopoly on energy supply. I would say that there are lots of examples of lots of really kind of positive examples of constructive partnerships between community energy groups and municipalities, or kind of municipal public suppliers. Um, so I think it's definitely possible. I think that there's kind of potential for partnerships to play to the strengths of the strengths of communities in engaging people and in kind of bringing them into a process, and potentially kind of tackling things like behavior change as well. Whilst using the resources that are available to to kind of larger entity, maybe like the PUC. So yeah, I think it's definitely possible for there to be constructive partnerships in this space.
And I think in Ontario, even there are some co-ops working on exactly that, engaging with municipalities that have energy plans, etc. Oh,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
meeting examples
Um,
too. Okay, there are a couple of more questions here, and we'll see if we can get through them. What is the timeline that it takes from beginning to producing power, and then also for the investors to get their return on investment?
Oh, yeah, good question. So the projects we work on typically have a lifespan of 20 years. So you get your kind of full investment back by the end of the 20-year lifespan, but you're getting a 3% a year return every year in between. So yeah, I mean that's one financial model. Definitely different community energy groups figure it different ways. The model that we use prioritizes creating a decently sized community benefit fund along the way. So you could, in theory, offer the same return on investment and kind of pay people their original investment back over a shorter lifespan if you sacrificed that community energy fund, but then you lose out on some of the benefits that are integral. The other thing about this 20-year lifespan is that the solar panels are guaranteed for a 20-year lifespan. They tend to work longer. We think they work longer, but 20 years is the sort of guaranteed lifespan. And so, in terms of risk management on an investment, that ties in nicely as well.
And what about like from start idea to production? I don't know. Not sure if you spoke to that. What's a typical timeline there?
That is a difficult question to answer. There is no tip. Well, yeah, it varies. Yeah, I mean, if for instance, if you've got a well-organized co-op that's already that's already delivered a few projects, that's kind of got a strong volunteer group, that knows how to run a community share offer and raise investment. You might be able to move from doing a feasibility study on a site through to raising money for an install within sort of a 6 to 12-month time frame. I would say that's a kind of best case scenario. There's things like planning permission, and other sort of tick boxes along the way in the process that take time. And as people involved in these projects are volunteers, it's also important to run things like community share offers on timescales that feel like they work for them. And so, that's kind of, that's something that can be quite flexible as well. Something that we've recently, that's kind of new to repowering, but that I know isn't new in the community energy space more broadly, is bridge financing. So essentially what we've got now is access to this sort of low-cost bridge financing loan that we can use to install solar panels up front before money's been raised through a community share offer, if we've done feasibility on a site and it's all kind of kind of technically possible to go ahead quite quickly. That de-risks the investment because the asset's already been installed for when you're then going to raise money through a community share offer. And the rest of the process works the same way. Essentially, what happens is once the co-ops run their community share offer and raised kind of the cost of the asset, then they pay back the loan, and they take ownership. So that's another model that can speed things along. But yeah, it
Okay.
varies.
Okay, yeah, that's always the answer. It depends. Okay, a couple of more questions here that we'll try and get to in maybe quickly, and then I think we'll have to have a wrap. There's a question about biomass and what the situation is in the UK. I don't know if you know anything about that. Uh,
Mm.
Speak at all about that.
I am probably not the right person to talk about biomass, to be honest. It's not something we work with. Um, and it's, yeah, I don't know. I would say the community energy model is technology agnostic. So this sort of model of community ownership can work for clean energy sources, whatever they are. But in terms of whether it's been done here, not that I'm aware of on a community energy model.
Okay. How about a question about the types of investments in the cooperative energy market how do they compare to corporate investments?
Mm.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, how do they compare? So
I'm not
I
sure if the
think
question is about like the
the
types of returns or yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think our projects are relatively low risk, I think, as investments go. And the oldest projects that Repowering's supported are going on 12, 13 years old now, and have kind of been reliably able to make their interest payments to investors as promised for that time scale. I think, yeah, there's not a huge interest rate that we're talking about here. If we're talking about 3% a year, other projects that offer 5 to 6% maybe get closer, but I think the risk reward balance here probably sits closer to low risk and reward in ways that go beyond financial returns. I think the other big, I guess, difference is that when you invest in a cooperative energy project, you become a member of that project in a way that means you have a stake in decision making and in kind of deciding how benefits get shared out in the place that you live in. And definitely surveys of our member investors. We found that people kind of say that being involved in a project like this makes them feel more connected to the place they live in, that they've kind of gained confidence in investing in other types of community projects, that sort of thing. So there's all these immaterial benefits as well.
Mhm. I think I know we've talked about this, so you have a few resources to post
Oh, yes.
chat for us as well, and I think there are a couple of Canadian alternatives to from an investment perspective that you were able to find. Two
Yes.
two more
I'm
quick
glad you
questions.
reminded me of that.
Okay, good. And two more quick questions. One, have you seen a case where the community benefit fund created for the co-op was used for other energy efficiency initiatives that could reduce energy poverty further? Have you seen that happen where the community benefit fund was used?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's some kind of easy examples where it's been spent on, for instance, draft proofing materials. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of light touch stuff that we're talking about. But but yeah, I think we're not in a place at the moment with any of these projects where their community fund is big enough to start tackling like the cost of whole house retrofit. But I think the spirit is definitely there. So yeah. And I've
Um,
started to post various bits of links that I wanted to leave in the chat and almost forgot about. Essentially a bit of signposting there if you want to copy and paste it out to who you've got locally to look into.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. Um, do you know if there's a comparable nonprofit to Repowering in Canada?
I don't think there is doing quite what, or I haven't haven't found one doing quite what we're doing. Um, but there is there are a few kind of larger co-ops in Ontario in particular. There's also this Community Energy Cooperative Canada network that was founded just last year to kind of represent the renewable energy co-op sector. So the link to their website is in the chat as well. But our sort of, I guess, role as a community energy development organization, I haven't found anything quite like it. I think, it's also, it makes the process easier for local level co-ops, but it's not essential. And there are loads of co-ops that do it with sort of peer support as well. One of the core principles of cooperatives is that they collaborate with other cooperatives. So it tends to be a good space for kind of peer mentorship and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anybody has a burning question before we wrap up, you can unmute yourself and ask, or maybe Ted needs to allow you to unmute yourself. I'm not sure. Um, or if you know how to raise your hand, you can raise your hand. I'll just give a minute in case there's anyone who would like to do that. Okay, well, since it is 8:36, then I think we will wrap up. Thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time, for giving us a glimpse into some possibilities that I think we may not have been aware of. I know I've learned some things for sure, and given us some new ways of thinking about energy and also community capacity and community building. Lots to think about, and perhaps for us to act upon sometime here in Sault Ste. Marie. Thank you. Um, Before we go, I want to also just give a quick pitch for our next webinar. I mentioned that it's on Wednesday, November 27th at 7:30 p.m. We have another great speaker, Dr. Christine Stortini, who's a science advisor with the Climate Change Science Branch of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And she's going to talk about her marine biologist perspective on the human-ocean connection. So something quite different, and it should be really engaging too. So thanks to Rachel, thanks for our organizers, and thanks to everyone who has participated today. We really appreciate you attending this, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.